Hello, my name is Matt Pichelle, Director of Product Marketing for Aerospike, and it's my pleasure to serve as moderator for today's webinar, Battling Fraud and Risk in Real Time, Why the Database Matters. Before we get started, first I'll cover a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and both the recording and slides will be made available afterwards. Please enter your questions using the chat feature in GoToWebinar. Questions will be handled at the end. Any questions we don't get will be followed up via email. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Today's guest speaker is Andras Cser, Vice President, Principal Analyst, serving security and risk professionals for Forrester. His research focuses on strategy, cost-benefit analysis, architecture, performance, and scalability of identity and access management systems and provisioning solutions. Prior to joining Forrester, Andras served as a security architect with CA Technical Services through the NetTegrity acquisition. Andras will be joined by Sam Jackson, Director of Product Management, Fraud Detection and Prevention of Neustar. Sam is the product leader for fraud detection solutions. His goal is to leverage industry-leading identity data, real-time signals, and machine learning to bring world-class anti-fraud solutions to market for Neustar, where he's also held product management roles in their identity platform, data strategy, as well as for the company's core architecture. And now we'll hand it over to Andras. Andras, please take it away.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? That's good? Okay, so next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about why real-time and consortium information matters, right, in fighting fraud and risk. And I'd really like to kind of talk about a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be diving into today, right? So obviously we'll talk about the balance between security, customer satisfaction, operational efficiencies, look at the landscape of the transactions that fraud impacts and the channels, then understand how all the fraud prevention can all be organized into a landscape and architecture, and kind of navigate through this, look into machine learning adoption and understand why it might have been hampered by unrealistic expectations. Then look at mobile fraud and understand how mobile fraud takes data assets from other third-party sources, consortium data sources. And mobile payments are also an important aspect, and then look at the shared and consortium information side of the house and show a little bit of a detail around how that fits into the corporate fraud and risk fighting architecture, and finally talk about some recommendations. So let's dig in. Next slide, please. So fraud management is usually a pretty difficult balance and a hard problem to solve. Obviously you have security, which is typically keeping the bad guys out, or reducing your fraud losses, or making sure that you don't let money laundering activities take place in your organization. Then you have obviously operational efficiencies. These are areas of how you make sure that you don't spend all the time that you have in the world in manual investigation and hiring a lot of investigative resources. Then obviously the most important these days is customer satisfaction. Reducing friction is always a pretty important aspect. Next slide, please. Obviously, fraudsters are always one step ahead of banks. They don't have to be compliant. They really just need to be able to steal money, right, from the banks and other financial organizations, digital assets. So that's their goal, right? That's what they want to do. They have to do this in the shortest possible time. Fraudsters really only have to get it right once, versus banks and other kind of digital assets organizations. They have to get it right all the time. So it's like continual way of protecting against fraud is very important. Omnichannel models are very much behind. We see a lot of new channels emerging, peer-to-peer, new types of chatbot types of or intelligent agent-based activity monitoring. This is all using different infrastructure and rails, necessarily from old school platforms like web, mobile apps. You have to be able to prepare to fight fraud on all these other channels. And lastly, on this slide, the EFM data and analytics skills are really hard and expensive to get. This really boils down to you cannot really hire a world-class talent that easily. So you kind of have to have tools and have to be able to actually operationalize those tools. You cannot rely on manual one-off kind of processes or even in-house built solutions. Next slide, please. So just make sure that everything appears here, please. Fraud definitely impacts a lot of different transaction types, right? You'll look at cards, you can look at ACH, you can look at wires, you can look at ATMs, you can look at online banking. It has to be real-time and peer-to-peer context applicable as well. Next, please. And obviously card present and card not present transactions, CP and CNP transactions, as well as debit and credit card transactions all present different kinds of challenges for this. So for all these types of channels and for all these types of transaction types, you have to have good coverage. Next slide, please. So obviously how customers interact with you will have channels, right? So you'd see people interacting with the online and mobile web-based channels, so typically web channels where you have a large number of attributes that you can look at, or mobile applications, point of sale types of terminals, in-person communications, so in-branch types of transactioning, call center, you can call the call center on the phone. Then there's kiosks, chats, chatbots, and even in some geographies, direct email-based customer service and snail mail, so regular old school fraud management is still a huge concern, right? So a lot of geographies, they allow folks to transact in person or snail mail or email wise without any necessary authentication or strong authentication. Next slide, please. So it's definitely a difficult and hard nut to crack, right? You got a lot of different layers, a lot of different transaction types, a lot of different channels, a lot of new types of transactions, and a lot of business tolerance towards fraud, and specifically in these newer kinds of channels such as mobile, but even peer-to-peer, chatbot, and intelligent agents. Next slide, please. So this is just a high-level view of fraud management architecture. You start from identity proofing and vetting, understanding who you let in. Are they the right person? Are they who they claim they are? Then you may be protecting malware and endpoints that can be difficult to support. And then you look at continuous and risk-based authentication in a user agent, mobile app, online web, or any kind of agent you use. And then you use transaction management and transactional monitoring, which is the last item. And then obviously there's other elements or contexts such as employee fraud, identity resolution, behavioral profiling, and link analysis and information sharing that comes to play here. So and obviously information sharing is one of the most important things here that we see a lot of folks talking about. If you go to the next slide, please. We see machine learning mechanisms being adopted more and more in fraud management types of contexts. The reason is, rule writing is really becoming very arduous and laborious. In order for you to be able to maintain a large set of rules, you have to have good what-if analysis, training methods, and really a lot of times it's not entirely clear what happens if you modify or delete rules. So instead of this, and also in order to be able to protect against threats or fraud types and patterns that you have not seen in the past, you have to look at machine learning. And this is obviously supervised and unsupervised mechanisms. But the problem here is that a lot of times we've seen machine learning adoption being hampered by unrealistic expectations. So some of the methods that are being used have not scaled. Some of these methods have not been able to provide good explanation of decisioning, why you deem the transaction to be fraudulent versus not fraudulent versus needed to be investigated, right? So it's labeling. Skill sets are really difficult in adopting machine learning. Again, like I said, we see data scientists are being very in short supply on today's job market. And again, operational adoption and the hype around this is still hard. But in spite of all this, and if you go to the next slide, machine learning is bound for growth, right? So the computing power grew. It leads constantly to learning algorithms, machine learning algorithms improvement that can lead to operationalization, that can obviously lead to the transformation of machine learning into artificial intelligence, performance and scale improvements, and drastically improved detection rates. So we are estimating that everything being equal, machine learning is able to provide about the 30% higher performance, higher throughput detection rate of fraud, and also about keeping the false positive rates where they are, a little bit better in improved value detection rates if you look at the lift curves or Lorentz curves of algorithms. And again, this is leading, fortunately, now in the past year, 18 months, to decreasing the hype around machine learning. Next slide, please. So what are some of the channels that we see activities coming in? Definitely important to look at the mobile banking interfaces, so online banking, mobile banking, retailers' own websites like eBay, SIM cards, mobile operators, and as well as mobile wallets. And the last thing that, if you move forward, please, mobile applications, understanding how mobile fraud, if it impacts you, it is all through these channels and shapes and sizes. Next slide, please. Okay. So there's definitely differences between mobile fraud. Obviously, and desktop fraud. So mobile fraud and desktop fraud are different, and you have to have a lot of data that you can bring into both of these contexts, right? So obviously, the fraudsters' investment and involvement for desktop fraud is relatively high because you have to buy laptops or emulate laptops or desktops. Mobile, you can do this at much greater scales. The IP address volatility is much lower on the desktop fraud, much higher on the mobile fraud. People move about. The device fingerprint richness can be much higher on mobile devices. You may be able to collect a lot of operating system level information versus just browser-based information on the desktop. And then the existing tool maturity and being able to use consortium shared data to support your decisioning. Obviously, in desktop fraud has been medium to high, so this is the area we've been seeing most of the data being used. But the coverage for mobile devices and mobile fraudulent activity is really still low. Ease of distributing the fraudsters' work, again, with desktop fraud is pretty low. You kind of have to invest in desktops and be able to kind of attack sites from those desktops versus mobile devices. You can have your friends in your circles kind of do this, or you can run emulators. And the number of transaction attributes usable for enterprise fraud management is obviously low or to medium on the desktop side, and a lot higher operating system level variables can be brought in, so you can have a lot more activity. So next slide, please. So make sure that everything shows, please. So again, in mobile payments, we require new fraud management approaches. just kind of moving beyond this 1951 paradigm that it's the plastic card or paper card, whoever owns it can make the payment. In today's online digital world, it's not the card but the identity that matters, right? So obviously card present and card not present transactions and payments are equally impacted by these mobile payments. And then we all require a high resolution payment data set, right, that adds location, device-based notification, and authentication really before the payment can occur, right? And this is absolutely relevant and important for any kind of payment, cards, as well as newer types of peer-to-peer payments such as Zelle and other platforms. So how do you provide all this information? The way you provide all this information, and if you go to the next slide, please, it is the breadth and depth of your consortium shared information. So make sure the title appears there as well. So you have to have the breadth and depth of consortium information that actually shows up in this context, right? So again, in order for an organization and a bank, digital assets management company, really any kind of an organization to fight a fraud network, you have to have a data provider network, right? You have to be able to consume information about fraudulent activities, whitelists, blacklists, even templatized ways of templates of fraud risk scoring best practices. Next slide, please. So it takes, a network to fight a network, right? So if you look at the propagation and the use of shared information, you want to have a unified external intelligence stream, identity information, hacked user IDs, hacked passwords, hacked device IDs, bad IP addresses, bad locations, bad behavioral types, and many maybe bad addresses. We can look at transactional information as well. Ideally, you want to feed this into a software as a service delivery form factor identity verification fraud management tool and solution there as well. So this is a really important thing that if you have that, that means that the vendor of the tool can real-time update policies and protect all players and all customers in the network against fraudulent activity and data loss and really any kind of bad things really in this context. So this tool, software as a service fraud management tool, you can then look at things like whitelists, blacklists, templates, device IDs, etc., and again can represent this to multiple customers, right? So we'll go to the next slide, please. Why should we use consortium data, right? Obviously, you can learn from the competitors' mistakes and best practices if you're a bank or an insurance company, etc. Modeling good and bad behaviors, right? So understanding what good and bad behaviors look like, even if you personally, if your organization has not seen these behaviors, right? Obviously, the fraudsters will not respect boundaries between verticals, lines of businesses, geographies, and transactions. They'll just kind of go where the money is, and follow the path of least resistance, right? So they will not just go to insurance companies or just maybe online retailers or banks. They will hop across these verticals for stealing data and stealing goods and services, making fraudulent payments, performing account takeover, etc. The consortium data obviously allows for vendors to differentiate themselves. The bigger the consortium set, the better, and the richer data set you can use, the more you can have insight in terms of business intelligence to fraud data. So the bigger data set also helps you resolve fraudulent data and allow you to deduce BI, business intelligence information, marketing information from your fraud data. Obviously, it helps you solve harder problems like call center authentication, as mobile payments, as we talked about in our problem statement today, and really collaboration between payment data and customer data, as well as device-specific data or offline data, can help really triangulate fraudsters, fraud rings and groups, and identify them better with a lot lower number of false positives. So again, beating the fraudster and not each other is the whole promise of using consortium data. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through all that. So using consortium data is absolutely important, and how we see people use this, right, and then do this. Creating executive level reason codes for things like machine learning algorithms, and allowing people internally and externally understand the reasons of your decisions. Beefing up the big data expertise and tools. This also translates into data science as well. Understand the consortium data and its sources. So it's really a good idea if you're an end user organization to actually get an understanding what your data provider, consortium data provider, actually uses as tools, uses as data sources, how they actually apply data enrichment and data quality improvement methods to the data sets that they provide or base their decisioning on. Paying attention to privacy is a must, right? Within today's environment where you got GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Act, these are all, it's no longer an optional exercise. You have to pay attention to this to avoid fines. Obviously, making sure that the vendor can do unsupervised training as to how they risk score and how they provide data elements to your decisioning process is very important. Visibility into any model for risk scoring is something that organizations are increasingly demanding. They want to understand why and how their vendors reach the decisions they actually reach. And then pool the data across and within banks. So this is creating intra-bank repositories or intra-organizational repositories. If you have multiple lines of businesses that you can actually share blacklists, whitelists, and templates. So if in the case of a bank, if you find a fraudster that's been committing fraudulent activity in the retail banking side of the house, they shouldn't be able to go to the commercial banking or lending side of the house and commit fraudulent there. And obviously, using consortium data is very important. So next slide, please, real quick. So some of our expectations. So we are looking at identity verification or IDV, lightweight kinds of processes based on consortium data. Identity verification that is a much lighter weight than going through all the credit header file details to be able to authenticate knowledge-based authentication a user. Identity verification or IDV for specific verticals, government, healthcare, looking at those areas, or even institutional identity verification. Mobile device payment models, incorporating a lot more of the contextual variables and distributed consortium-based data. Faster payment models will, if you want to be able to do risk scoring for these, you have to have consortium data, because all this is real time now. And then 3D secure adoption, obviously a bit higher globally, which is still low in North America, but higher in EMEA. We expect some advances there. The whole machine learning, the big data being incorporating more and more shared data elements coming into focus. And account takeover focus continuing. I mean, there's nothing new about this. And holistic approaches, understanding the pre-login, during the login, post-login, and cyber threat landscape to be able to keep the bad guys out across all these multiple channels is also an interesting element. And lastly, blockchain-based consortium data, whitelist, blacklists, so even storing pointers or the data elements in themselves on a blockchain technology, so that you have a consortium with a quorum around what is a really an item, an element, and a blacklist or whitelist is something that we're going to likely see in the next 2 to 3 years. So with that, I'd like to conclude my part of today's presentation and hand it over to Sam.
Hi, Andras, or thanks, Andras. Yeah, so that was great. I'm Sam Jackson. I'm Director of Product Management for Risk Solutions at Neustar. My focus is really with the development of new products, specifically targeting fraud detection and prevention. Previously, I worked on Neustar's identity graphs And in general, my background has really been around identity management, previously in ad tech, but increasingly for other use cases. These days, I'm heavily involved in product strategy, data science, R&D, and our various other product initiatives. At a previous stage in life, I was also a software engineer and an architect. So following up on what Andras said, I'm going to state the obvious. Fraud is really big business. To put things in perspective, card fraud worldwide from 2015 to 2020 is expected to total about $183 billion. And only 9% of consumers surveyed said that they're very confident that their financial institutions are going to be capable of keeping their data secure. So most businesses already understand the risk. They've read the headlines. They know that brand reputation can take a major hit when, retailers or credit card companies have their confidential data exposed. By some accounts, businesses are now spending $9.3 billion annually as a response to this, mainly on fraud prevention and fraud detection. So why do we find ourselves in this situation? I think the main reason is really just that identity fraud is incredibly lucrative. In 2017, we saw a 113% increase in new account fraud from the previous year. There were over 8,000 data breaches in 2017, which is almost a 650% increase from 2016. And, in total, that's something like 1 billion records that, fraudulently were exposed in 2017 alone. And so, you look at these numbers, they're very scary, but some companies, I guess, are still left wondering, why does this matter to their bottom line? I would say that, the main reason is that fraud has a direct impact on the relationship that you have with your customers, specifically the level of trust that consumers have in your business. And this kind of creates a problematic situation for a lot of brands. Unfortunately for many businesses, fortifying themselves against fraud means making consumers jump through hoops. And that creates considerable friction, which leads to abandonment and customer dissatisfaction in general. Just to cite one example, North American businesses rejected something like 3% of all US and Canadian orders due to suspicion of fraud in 2016. But it was later found that close to 10% of those orders were not fraud at all. They were genuine, and presumably the customers are now very upset. They were turned down. So with the rise of the professional cyber criminal, and we're talking about very organized crime here. Entrepreneurs who run companies in office parks, and with all the sophisticated techniques that they can leverage, it's no longer enough to trust that the person on the end of the transaction is who they say they are. As Andras said, this is really about the identity rather than the card being present. But you also can't be overly cautious and slow the customer interaction to the point where it becomes too much of a hassle, and the users get upset and go elsewhere. So, what are businesses supposed to do? How do you separate the good customers from the fraudsters? Well, to Andras's point about consortia data, I would say that there have been evolution of all these techniques that are now used for frictionless fraud prevention. We talked about behavioral biometrics, device fingerprinting, various approaches to anomaly detection. These are all really great techniques that definitely catch different types of threats. One of the most popular, themes across all of this to emerge in recent years is a methodology that has been termed device reputation. And so this is really, a segment of different product offerings that utilize device fingerprinting techniques to persistently identify devices within a cooperative consisting of their customers or other partners. So kind of what we think of as a consortia. And in these scenarios, customers provide fraud feedback data. The brands themselves. So, a vendor will benefit from the network effect, wherein the customers of that vendor basically provide feedback as to which devices are seen to be fraudulent and which ones are safe. And so device risk can then be assessed according to user behavior across the cooperative network, and ultimately device reputation emerges from that. And this methodology works really, really well. In fact, it's actually led to a lot of different acquisitions over the last few years, with things really starting to heat up in 2018. To put it in perspective, ThreatMetrics was acquired by LexisNexis for $830 million. And so, yeah, I mean, clearly this trend is catching on, and I would say that it's now, arguably the most formidable type of fraud prevention technology that's out there in the market. And yet, fraud threats still persist, and in fact, they're growing. So clearly, device reputation is not really sufficient in and of itself. And so that's where my company, Neustar, comes in. We like to think of our data as a complement to all of the other approaches that we've talked about. We provide actionable intelligence in real time to give fraud models the extra boost that they need to stop criminals without forgoing a strong customer experience. Our approach is really all about identity. Who is the person behind the browser, behind the device? Who controls the phone? Is their IP address connected to a normal household, or does it reflect some anomalous condition like an anonymizer proxy or data center co-location, that kind of thing? We store huge volumes of data linking people and households to all kinds of digital identifiers. This is really the basis of what we do across all the different verticals that we operate in. We are an information services company, and identity is the foundation of our business. It's really our enterprise heritage. For the last 20 years, we've grown up as an identity company. We manage the majority of the caller ID infrastructure. Previously, we were heavily involved in what's called number portability, which allows you to take a phone from one carrier and take it to the next. We manage massive amounts of data across the world's advertising networks. We're a leading player in ad technology in general. We also have a lot of different security offerings and other things like global DNS. We work with every leading bank and across every major industry. So, for example, on the marketing side, we have different offerings that help with advertising to specific audiences and tracking the efficacy of that advertising, or matching a set of emails to a cookie pool so that you can advertise directly to your customers. In the risk business, which is what I work on, we focus on fraud prevention, but we also do a lot of other things like around compliance risk and operational efficiency. On the security side, we work to stop DDoS, and we manage a variety of different network tools that make sure that your brand's identity is always resolvable on the internet. And then on the communication side, we're heavily involved in telecommunications infrastructure, and that's really kind of the genesis of how we grew up as an identity services company. And so for all of these reasons, Visa selected Neustar as their digital identity partner after doing extensive due diligence. We're at all of the top 10 banks, the top 5 credit card issuers, and generally hundreds of brands trust Neustar's identity resolution expertise to mitigate risk and improve overall operational efficiency. How do we do it? Well, all of this comes together through what's called the Neustar OneID system. It's the industry-leading repository of offline and online data assets. We break it down, corroborate it, and rebuild it roughly every 15 minutes. And all of the data that comes in comes from companies that have direct billing relationships with their customers. We leverage this always-on network of data partners to provide constantly updated customer attributes and device identity linkages, which span both online and offline identity. And as you can see from the slide, the scope of this identity repository is quite staggering. So far, I've been a bit vague on the details of how we operate in the fraud prevention space. I'm going to walk through a few examples now. When somebody opens a new account, we can tell you if their identity checks out using authoritative telco data. This is different from a lot of the credit header data that's oftentimes used for identity verification. And because it's directly tied to the telcos themselves, it can't really be spoofed or disrupted in the same way that a compromised credit header file could be. When someone tries to call into your call center, we can quickly flag whether the caller is safe or if they're spoofing a number. We can tell you if their phone has recently been ported, which could mean that the communication has already been compromised. We can tell you all kinds of things about the behavior of the user's device, their browser, and their IP address. And we keep all of this data current and serve it up in real time. Increasingly, fraudsters are using different techniques to hijack our phone lines. And so, for example, this is just one example of the types of things that, organized crime can use that, your consortia data isn't necessarily going to be able to prevent on its own. So, for example, a fraud ring might use social engineering or work with insiders at a phone company to perpetrate a phone fraud along the lines of SIM swap, where they basically assign your number to a new SIM card, meaning that your texts and phone calls go to a different device, or call forwarding, which is a very similar technique on that's usually done through malware, or number porting. In all these different cases, it makes it appear that the fraudster is calling from a number that belongs to a legitimate customer. Or the fraudsters can use these same techniques to intercept multi-factor authentication tokens to allow them to reset a password and take over an account. And so this means that companies need a better way to authenticate and verify their consumers, both online and offline, in real time, to prevent financial losses, brand damage, and the loss of consumer trust. And Neustar has the data and expertise to solve all of these problems. Recently, I've been working on a product called Digital Identity Risk. The solution detects fraud during account opening by comparing the applicant's submitted personal data to information that we've collected about their device. So basically, device-based observations that allow us to tie a given device to a household or to an individual, and then other characteristics that give us an indicator as to whether or not the user should be treated as high risk or low risk. Based on these types of signals, and usually in collaboration with consortia data or other techniques, we're able to signal to the brand whether or not they can trust a user and therefore provide a low friction experience, or maybe tag a risky looking user for manual review. So not only do you mitigate fraud and improve the customer experience, you also end up increasing operational efficiencies by driving greater digital adoption. So hopefully this goes some way towards explaining why we believe that linking offline identity to device identity is sort of essential, as ingredients in a robust fraud prevention program. So how did we get here? I've talked a lot about the essential ingredients for identity resolution and some of the ways that we at Neustar leverage our data for fraud solutions. I keep using a term when I talk about this, which is real time. Real time is crucial here. All of the data that we need for making these decisions needs to be available in real time. And for that reason, a few years back, we kicked off a project to re-architect our delivery infrastructure. At the time, I was a key stakeholder, despite being in product management. I had a seat at the table for the design process. I offered up this diagram to engineering as my definition of a nirvana state for our real-time delivery platform. I'm somewhat comfortable sharing it here, mainly because this design is not really all that far off from other paradigms that we see across the industry. It just happened to be my vision of what we thought we needed. So as you can see, we have an edge application tier that talks directly to Aerospike. Aerospike provides us with blazing fast I/O, and that's really kind of a crucial ingredient to keep all this data up to date and access it for all the different applications that we need, kind of myriad of data attributes in real time for. I also considered some of our needs around the rapid aggregation of real-time signals and how that would overlap with machine learning. And again, Aerospike provided the performance we needed to make all of this possible. Having said that, we did go through a fairly involved selection process. We looked at a lot of different database technologies, not just Aerospike. We did a lot of benchmarking, and we modeled the costs for these different solutions. Neustar was already using Aerospike a little bit, like on our advertising side, with some of our offerings around personalization and our DMP. And so I guess you could say that Aerospike had an incumbent advantage, but naturally we did have to look at a lot of other technologies to make sure that it was really the best thing for our particular use cases. And in general, I think we liked it because it gave us the performance that we needed at a price that we could afford. Given that this is a public forum, I'm not really all comfortable sharing my thoughts on some of the competition. We could suffice to say that there were some decent alternatives and some other options that underperformed. Overall, we were happiest with Aerospike. I tried to outline some of the reasons why we came to this conclusion with a slide, on the value prop right here. First of all, just consider our use case. We read and write massive amounts of key value data, and we have to do so with minimal latency. For any given device or any given individual, in the United States, we need to be able to rapidly get back their data and, connect it with other data sets and run some models in real time. And, Aerospike is really great for this use case, particularly for applications that are heavily focused on random I/O. Aerospike performs incredibly well. It achieves a high throughput at very low latency, and the cost is not so bad. And so, overall, the value is pretty clear, especially with some of the various updates that Aerospike is making now. We can really achieve great scale at a fairly low cost, and all of the scales up linearly. Another thing to know about Neustar is that in some ways we're a little bit old school in how we operate. We like to deploy and host our own hardware. For us, it's just generally more economical than the cloud. Not for everything, but for some things. And with that in mind, Aerospike is very easy to deploy, host, and scale up. And then finally, I guess I'd say that Aerospike has the features that we're looking for. It goes well beyond what you get with a traditional key value store. For example, we're heavy users of the secondary indexes. And we're pretty excited about the roadmap too. The real-time analytics framework seems very well suited to our use cases, where we have to kind of run models and do other forms of machine learning. So overall, we are very happy customers. So that's all I have to say on the topic right now. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. If you have any questions or interest in learning more about Neustar or our offerings, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or via email at sam.jackson@team.neustar. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Matt for some Q&A.
Awesome. Yeah. No, we've got just a few minutes for Q&A, so thanks, Sam. While our audience looks at the Aerospike fraud and risk resources, by all means, we encourage you to download those. So while I've got you and Andras still here together, I've got a question for you, Sam. In terms of are there main challenges in moving beyond device reputation online to digital identity offline? What are the main linkages there and the challenges of establishing those?
Well, I think there's just a number of things to consider with any kind of device reputation consortium. So it's very effective for flagging good users that already have a presence on a network. It's going to be more problematic for flagging new devices that haven't actually been captured and modeled previously. And then there's oftentimes a lot of other signal that cannot just emerge through the network effect of having various data providers sharing information with each other. I gave the example of SIM swapping previously, where basically somebody can manipulate somebody at a telco, one of the mobile carriers, and get them to assign a number to a new SIM card. That's the sort of thing that happens in moments and could allow a bank account to be compromised and rapidly emptied. And getting in front of that kind of threat requires real-time signals that tie the user of that bank account, their identity, to a specific phone, and knowing that phone hasn't been compromised or ported to another number. And so yeah, I just think depending on the use case, you really need additional data attributes that are available in real time and kind of are above and beyond what you would get through a consortia of trusted devices.
Sure. Real time sounds like the answer. Okay. And Josh, you say that machine learning is stated to grow. Are there any specific infrastructure needs that'll be there that you're seeing? And are there infrastructure requirements that you're seeing between real time and offline?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, obviously, real time has, in most cases, a lot more infrastructure requirements. Obviously, how well machine learning can work depends on a number of things. Obviously, the algorithms that you use, and but also the data that you put into them, right? So the more you're able to actually enhance and augment your data sets using any kind of big data or consortium data or your own transactional processing data, it makes the accuracy and improves the accuracy of the machine learning algorithms. And I think the expectations are always important here as well. Machine learning is not a be-all end-all type of thing. It's more of a tool set in your toolbox to fight fraudulent activity.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think one super quick question to Sam. You talked about indicating that Neustar rebuilds the data set every 15 minutes. Is that augmenting the data set every 15 minutes? Or, if you do indeed rebuild it, how do you leverage the old data? What do you do with the old data? Or could you just comment a little bit on that? Because it just sounds like a massive undertaking.
Yeah, well, I think your characterization, I get that some nuance there. The reality is we have massive amounts of data. It's not really all of the same provenance, and so certain aspects of it are rebuilt, on a 15-minute basis, or actually in some cases faster than that. That's particularly true of signals that we get from telecommunication networks, where things are actually happening to people's devices in real time, and all that needs to be collected. We have other signals that come from our advertising network that necessarily have to go through an aggregation process before they reach these databases, and so the latency there might be on the order of an hour. And then we have other cases where we're getting offline data, so information about where people live, who they're married to, that kind of thing. And that data may only arrive, once a week or once a month, and so there isn't the same necessity in rebuilding those aspects of our identity graph in real time. To your point, it's not that the whole thing is constantly reconstructed. That would be redundant and unnecessary. It's just that the bits of data that really need to be up to date and accurate down to the minute, we have devised techniques to allow us to handle those use cases.
Oh, that makes sense. And that, there'd be information updating as a user for sure. That's given how many millions of users you follow, it's pretty impressive. All right, we'll end on this final question. It's kind of to each of you, so I'll start with Andras, because each of you referred to the balance of kind of this friction point between customer satisfaction on one end and security on the other. And as a technology vendor, it seems like the solution would be, and you can agree or disagree to some level, which is really the question, is not the solution just more data, smarter machine learning, and just overall speed? I don't know, Andras, can you react to that?
I think, the security versus ease of use, right, is always going to depend on, the pre-existing kind of understanding of the user, the activity, the peer group of the user, et cetera, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and then the more of the consortium data obviously would help with the pre-existing information. The more the big data that you pull in helps with the pre-existing information. The more your algorithms are able to kind of make calls and store some of this pre-existing information, and that you're not like decisioning in a vacuum, but looking at a sequence of transactions. The more reliable your algorithms and the decisioning and treatment of the customer will be in terms of fraudulent or not fraudulent activity, which will ultimately lead to better customer satisfaction and obviously fewer false accepts and false rejects.
How about you, Sam? How would you react to that?
Well, I guess I would just say that, it's a moving target. There's always going to be new channels that emerge. Those channels are going to have different expectations in terms of how a customer interacts with the brand. there's usually some lag in terms of the development of tools and the adoption of those tools to address the specific challenges of those channels. But that's what makes this an interesting job for me. Every day I get to come in and look at new types of fraud, new types of emerging threats, and try to think about ways that we could mitigate all of that. So yeah, unfortunately, it is absolutely a challenge and a moving target for anybody that's on the brand side trying to fight fraud. But it gives rise to all this innovation that leads to these cool technological breakthroughs. And I am hopeful that overall we'll start to see fraud trends reversing worldwide.
Okay. All right. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I wanted to thank both Sam and Andras for their insights and their materials. Again, we'll make these materials available, both the slides and the recording. And for any questions we weren't able to get to, I'll make sure that Andras or Sam receive them. We'll get you your answers. So again, thanks everyone, and we appreciate it, and have a great day.